There was a moment, somewhere around 5,000 years ago, when human beings first looked up at the structure of their world and tried to explain it in writing. What they wrote down was not chaos. It was a hierarchy, a council, a divine order so precisely arranged that it mirrored, or perhaps invented, in every system of governance that came after it. At its center were the Anunnaki, and what they built in the tablets of ancient Mesopotamia was nothing less than the first theory of power. Because buried inside tablets that predate every major world religion is a question historians have debated for over a century. Were the Anunnaki gods, or were they something far more precise? A ruling class dressed in the language of divinity. And if they governed, what was humanity's place inside their system? The story begins not with a vision or a prophecy, but with clay. Around 3200 BC, scribes working in the cities of southern Mesopotamia, in Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, began pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet tablets. The system they developed is now called cuneiform, the oldest known writing on Earth, and the subject these early scribes returned to again and again was not trade, not war, not agriculture. It was the Anunnaki. These deities appear in the earliest surviving religious texts not as distant, unknowable forces, but as active administrators of a structured universe. The name itself encodes their function. In Sumerian, Anunna translates as the offspring of Anu, those of Anu's lineage. Anu, rendered as An in the earliest sources and later adapted into Akkadian tradition, occupied the supreme position in the celestial hierarchy, as the sky god whose domain extended across the highest heavens. The suffix attached to the root points downward, toward earth, toward land, toward the tangible world of rivers and cities and human hands. The Anunnaki were, in the most literal linguistic sense, beings whose authority bridged the cosmic heights and the ground beneath human feet. This was not an accidental construction. It was a theological argument embedded inside a name. Inscriptions from Uruk, among the earliest administrative documents ever recovered, contain references to the Anunna who judge and the greater Anunna of heaven and earth. These are not elaborate hymns or narrative poems. They are inventories, temple ledgers recording offerings. The implication is significant. By 3000 BC, the idea of a collective divine assembly governing both realms had already become institutional enough to appear in bureaucratic records. The concept was not emerging. It had already arrived. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BC during the third dynasty of Ur, but drawing on traditions far older, opens with one of the most striking declarations in ancient literature. Kingship descended from heaven. What follows is a sequence of rulers whose reign lengths are, by any rational measure, impossible. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, governed for 28,800 years. His successor at Bad Tibira, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. These figures have puzzled scholars for generations, and interpretations vary, but one reading is consistent across the academic literature. These numbers do not describe human reigns. They describe something else, a cosmic time scale, an era when earthly authority operated under direct divine supervision, before the world assumed the shorter rhythms of mortal rule. The Anunnaki, in other words, were present at the very beginning of organized human power, not as legend, but as the source from which that power was said to flow. The city of Eridu is not simply the oldest named city in Sumerian tradition. Excavations at the site have uncovered 17 successive temple levels, the earliest of which date to approximately 5000 BC. What archaeologists found was not a simple shrine. They found sophisticated architectural planning, cardinal direction orientation, and elevated platform construction, all hallmarks of what later texts explicitly describe as Anunnaki divine architecture. The physical record and the written record align. The theology did not invent the buildings. The buildings were there first, and the theology grew up around them. What separates the Anunnaki from the gods of most ancient traditions is this: the Sumerian texts do not present them as passive recipients of worship. They are decision-makers. The Eridu Genesis, known through Old Babylonian copies but preserving Sumerian traditions of considerably greater age, describes the Anunnaki holding assembly and assigning destinies. The great gods gathered. They deliberated. They decreed. Inscriptions from Nippur, the spiritual center of Mesopotamia, record how successive rulers restored Enlil's temple for the Anunnaki who decree fate, making it explicit that even the most powerful individual deity operated within a larger institutional framework. Enlil did not rule alone. He ruled as part of a collective. The cuneiform sources from Nippur also preserve the assembly's physical setting, the Shekinah, a cosmic chamber where 50 greater Anunnaki and 7 Anunnaki, who decree fate, convened to determine outcomes for gods and mortals alike. The number 7 carried specific weight in Mesopotamian cosmology, corresponding to the 7 visible planets and the 7-day temporal cycle that structured both divine and human time. This was not symbolic. It was architecture, a calendar and a council built into the same numerical system. Not every deity occupied the same rank within this structure. Cuneiform theology consistently distinguishes the Anunnaki from a separate class called the Igigi. Where the Anunnaki governed fundamental cosmic principles, the Igigi performed more specialized functions, associated in various texts with celestial observation and the labor required to maintain the physical world. The distinction matters because it tells us something about how the Sumerians understood hierarchy, not as a flat assembly of equals, but as a tiered system in which different categories of divine being carried different levels of authority and different degrees of freedom. And within the Anunnaki themselves, an inner executive existed, the 7 who decree fate, whose specific responsibility was the determination of individual and collective destiny. Power, in Mesopotamian theology, was always layered. The theology did not remain abstract. It structured every dimension of Mesopotamian life. Law codes show it. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the earliest known legal compilation, opens with the declaration that the king received his authority directly from An and Enlil. Earthly justice, in other words, derived from Anunnaki mandate. Temple economics show it. The Drehem Archive, dating to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, records thousands of animals sacrificed to Anunnaki deities throughout the calendar year, the material evidence of a civilization directing vast agricultural and economic resources toward maintaining divine favor. Ritual calendars show it. The Akitu festival, documented from the earliest Sumerian period through the final centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, centered on the symbolic renewal of kingship through Anunnaki approval. Each year, the reigning monarch underwent ritual procedures that recreated the original act of divine appointment. And architecture shows it most powerfully of all. Ziggurats, the massive tiered towers that rose above every major Mesopotamian city, were not simply temples. They were physical representations of the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth intersected. Their ascending levels encoded the divine hierarchy in stone and brick. The Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, dedicated to the father of the Anunnaki, was built with astronomical alignments precise enough to mark celestial events. It was theology made permanent. At the summit of this entire system stood three figures. Anu, the Sky Father, occupied the highest position, though his authority operated through delegation rather than direct intervention. Cuneiform texts consistently place him in the highest heaven, removed from daily administration, but functioning as final arbiter when conflicts among lesser deities could not be resolved. Enlil commanded the middle ground, the wind, the storm, the breath of the world, and above all, authority over humanity's fate. Enki governed the deep, wisdom, craft, fresh water, and creation. Together, they formed what Babylonian theologians would later formalize as the triad of great gods, three complementary domains, three distinct personalities, one executive structure. It was this triad that would make the first major decision about humanity. And that decision was not made out of kindness. The triad did not emerge fully formed. It crystallized slowly across centuries of theological refinement, across city-states that sometimes agreed and sometimes competed over which deity mattered most. But by the time Sumerian civilization reached its peak, the structure had hardened into something remarkably consistent. Three gods, three domains, one system. Understanding what happened next requires understanding who these three figures actually were, not as symbols, but as characters. Because the cuneiform tablets do not describe abstractions. They describe personalities, motivations, disagreements. And the earliest records reveal something that no later religious tradition would quite replicate. Gods who could be wrong, gods who could be outvoted, and gods who did not always agree on what to do with the world they governed. Anu sat at the top. In the oldest Sumerian texts, his position is unambiguous. He is the sky itself, not merely its ruler, but its embodiment. Tablets from Uruk describe his domain as the highest heaven, a realm so removed from earthly affairs that his direct involvement in them was rare. His authority was real, but it functioned the way the authority of a Supreme Court functions, decisive when invoked, but rarely the first voice in any deliberation. What Anu possessed above all else was legitimacy. His name alone conferred it. When a king needed divine sanction, it was Anu's authority he claimed. When a law needed cosmic backing, it was Anu's name that appeared first in the opening declaration. He was the source from which all other power derived, which meant, in practical terms, that the gods below him governed in his name, while he watched from a distance. Enlil governed what Anu delegated. Where Anu was remote, Enlil was present. His domain was the wind and the storm, forces that could not be seen but could level cities and drown harvests. In the theological literature, this translated into something more precise than weather. Enlil held the tablet of destinies, the document through which fates were assigned and enforced. To hold that tablet was to hold the mechanism of the world itself. Inscriptions consistently describe him as the most directly involved of the three in human affairs, and the most demanding. He expected order. He expected the maintenance of temples. He expected the world beneath him to function as designed. When it did not, the texts record his frustration in terms that read less like divine wrath and more like administrative displeasure. This matters, because it means the God most responsible for humanity's fate was also the one least inclined toward patience. Enki occupied a different position entirely. His domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, feeding rivers and springs and making agriculture possible. But Enki's role in the texts extends far beyond water management. He is the god of craft, of intelligence, of the kind of knowledge that solves problems. Wherever the divine assembly reached an impasse, it was typically Enki who proposed the solution no one else had considered. The early records describe him as the keeper of the me, a Sumerian concept with no clean translation, encompassing the fundamental laws, crafts, and institutions that made civilization function. Kingship was a me. Priesthood was a me. The art of writing itself was a me. Enki held them, distributed them, and occasionally used them in ways that not everyone in the assembly approved of. He was, in the most precise sense the texts allow, the god of unintended consequences. Together, these three figures governed a universe that ran, at least in theory, as a system. Heaven had its administrator. The earth and its storms had their enforcer. Knowledge and creation had their custodian. The divine assembly convened in the Shekinah to deliberate. The seven who decree fate rendered their judgments, and the world moved forward according to what had been decided. But there was a gap in the system. The tablets that describe this assembly also describe an enormous amount of labor required to maintain the cosmic order. Canals to be dug, fields to be maintained, temples to be built and rebuilt and staffed with offerings. Labor that had to come from somewhere. The texts are silent at this stage on where it came from. They would not stay silent for long. The first decision the divine assembly made about that problem would not simply shape one civilization or one era. It would define the entire trajectory of what came next. The easiest mistake to make when reading Sumerian theology is to treat the Anunnaki as a collection of individual figures, a pantheon in the Greek sense, where each god operates independently, pursuing personal agendas and occasionally colliding with one another. The tablets correct that impression quickly. The Anunnaki were not a cast of characters. They were an institution. The distinction is worth dwelling on because it changes everything about how the system functioned. Individual gods had names, domains, and personalities, but the authority that shaped the world, that assigned kingship, decreed fates, sanctioned or condemned, did not belong to any single deity. It belonged to the assembly. and the assembly operated by its own rules, its own procedures, its own internal hierarchy of rank and voice. Cuneiform sources from across the Sumerian period describe this body with a consistency that suggests it was not merely a literary device. The gods deliberated. They debated. Decisions required consensus among the senior members. When a choice was made, whether about the fate of a city, the appointment of a king, or the management of the earth itself, it carried the weight of collective authority, not individual will. This is why even Enlil, the most powerful active administrator in the divine order, is never described in the texts as acting purely alone on matters of cosmic consequence. His authority was immense, but it operated within a framework that was larger than any single deity. Nippur was where that framework was most visibly housed. The city held no political dominance in the way Uruk or Ur did. It controlled no major trade routes. It was not the seat of the most powerful king of any given era. What it held instead was something more durable: religious legitimacy. Nippur was the city of Enlil, and because Enlil held the Tablet of Destinies, Nippur became the place where earthly authority was ratified. Records show that rulers from across Mesopotamia, even those who had conquered rival cities and commanded vast armies, made pilgrimages to Nippur, not for military advantage, for validation. A king unrecognized by Nippur's priesthood was a king whose claim rested on force alone. A king recognized that ruled with the assembly's endorsement behind him. The temple complex at Nippur, known as the Ikur, meaning House of the Mountain, served as the earthly representation of Enlil's cosmic residence. Chronologies indicate that successive rulers across multiple dynasties invested heavily in its restoration and expansion, each one embedding their name in the brickwork as evidence of divine favor received and returned. The Ikur was not simply a place of worship. It was the administrative center of the divine order made physical. Within the assembly itself, rank determined function with precision the tablets describe in careful detail. The 50 greater Anunnaki formed the senior body, the full council whose collective presence gave weight to any decision made in the Shekinah. Below them, or rather nested within them as a specialized executive, sat the 7 who decree fate. These 7 carried specific and formidable responsibility, the final assignment of individual and collective destinies. Where the full assembly deliberated, the 7 rendered judgment. The number was not arbitrary. 7 planets were visible to the naked eye in ancient Mesopotamia, and Sumerian cosmology mapped the celestial and the administrative onto the same numerical framework. The 7 who decree fate were, in a structural sense, the planets made institutional. Cosmic forces given a council chamber and a mandate. Then there was the second tier, not Anunnaki, but not human either. The Igigi occupied a position in the divine order that the tablets define with careful consistency. Subordinate to the Anunnaki in authority, but divine in nature. Their name carries associations with watching, with observation, and in the earliest texts they appear as a workforce, not the architects of cosmic order, but its maintenance crew. The system, as designed, made a certain brutal logic. The Anunnaki governed. The Igigi labored. Canals were dug to manage the flooding rivers. Fields were cleared and maintained to produce offerings. The infrastructure of civilization, the physical work of keeping the world ordered, fell to this second class of divine beings. On the surface it held. The assembly convened. Fates were decreed. The Ikur received its offerings. The rivers ran between their banks. From the highest heaven where Anu dwelt to the subterranean waters of Enki's domain, the structure appeared to function as intended. But structure and sustainability are different things. The Igigi had been laboring since before human memory. Generations of toil with no end decreed, no relief granted, no voice in the assembly that governed their existence, and the ones doing that labor were beginning to break. The Atrahasis epic is one of the oldest complete narratives ever recovered. Inscribed across 3 tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, and dating in its surviving form to approximately 1700 BC, it draws on Sumerian traditions considerably older than the clay it was pressed into. Scholars have pieced it together from fragments held across multiple collections, the British Museum, the Louvre, private acquisitions, and what emerges from those fragments is a story that begins not with humanity, but with a labor dispute among gods. The opening is blunt. Before humans existed, the Igigi worked, and the work had no horizon. The scope of what the Atrahasis epic describes is worth understanding in concrete terms, because the tablets do not speak in abstractions. They name the tasks. The Igigi dug the Tigris. They dug the Euphrates. They cut the channels that carried water from those rivers into the fields that fed the cities. They cleared the land. They broke the ground. They maintained the watercourses year after year, season after season, under the authority of an assembly that had decreed this arrangement, and saw no reason to revisit it. The epic places the duration of this labor at 40,000 years, in the cosmological reckoning of Mesopotamian tradition, not a hyperbole, but a statement about the depth of time involved. Whether understood literally, or as an expression of epochs beyond counting, the meaning is the same. This had been going on for longer than any individual Igigi could remember, and there was no indication it would ever stop. The texts describe the toil accumulating, the carrying baskets growing heavier in the telling. The language of the epic shifts, register when it moves into this section, from the measured cadence of divine administration into something rawer. Complaint, exhaustion, the specific weight of labor that is endless and unacknowledged. The breaking point came at night. The Atrahasis epic records the moment with a precision that gives it the texture of an actual event rather than a mythological set piece. The Igigi put down their tools. Then they did something more deliberate. They set fire to them. The burning of tools was not incidental. It was a declaration. There would be no return to work. The instruments of their labor were gone. Then they marched. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the Ikur, the house of the mountain, the seat of the assembly's executive authority, and they refused to leave. The epic describes the scene with a detail that reads, across the distance of nearly 4,000 years, as genuinely alarming to those inside. Torches surrounding the temple in the darkness, the sound of the Igigi outside, the demand for an audience that could not be politely declined. Enlil's response, recorded in the tablets, is not the composed reaction of an untroubled administrator. He is described as shaken. He summons his vizier, Nusku, and asks what is happening outside his walls. Nusku goes to look and returns with a report. Every Igigi is there, all of them. The labor force that maintained the physical order of the world has stopped, surrounded the temple of its highest authority, and is waiting. The assembly convened under conditions it had never faced before. Anu was summoned from the highest heaven. The senior Anunnaki gathered. And the question before them was not a philosophical one about the nature of divine order. It was immediate and practical. The system had stopped functioning. The beings responsible for its maintenance were in open revolt, and the assembly had no mechanism for forcing them back to work that did not risk making the situation worse. The epic captures the mood of the gathering with an image that remains striking. The great gods sitting in council, while the Igigi burned outside. The distance between the cosmic dignity of the Anunnaki assembly and the physical reality just beyond the temple walls is the tension the text holds without resolving. Enlil, for all his authority, could not simply decree the rebellion away. The tablet of destinies allowed him to assign fates, but a fate assigned to beings already in revolt carried no guarantee of compliance. The Igigi had, in the most literal sense, rejected the fate assigned to them. The assembly needed a solution that did not depend on the cooperation of those who had already demonstrated they would not cooperate. It was Enki who spoke. The tablets do not record a long deliberation before his proposal. What they record is a pivot. The assembly moving from the problem of what to do about the Igigi to the question Enki placed before them instead, a different question entirely, one that reframed everything. The answer he offered would not restore the old order. It would replace it with something new. The Anunnaki had a problem, and their solution would change the course of human history. Enki's proposal was not presented as a moral argument. There is no record in the Atrahasis epic of a speech about the dignity of the Igigi, no appeal to justice, no suggestion that the labor system had been wrong in principle. What Enki offered was engineering. The assembly had a functional problem. The workforce had collapsed, and he was proposing a structural fix. Create a substitute. The logic was clean. The Igigi had proven that divine beings, given sufficient time and sufficient grievance, would eventually refuse. Whatever replaced them needed to be different in a fundamental way, not merely reassigned, but designed for the purpose from the beginning, built for it, incapable by nature of the kind of organized refusal the assembly had just witnessed outside Enlil's temple. The Atrahasis epic records Enki's proposal, in terms the assembly accepted without extended debate. The texts do not describe dissent. They describe consensus, the great gods agreeing that what Enki suggested was the practical answer to an immediate crisis. What he proposed was the creation of Lulu, in Akkadian, the primitive worker. A being made to bear the load the Igigi had put down. The tablets are explicit on this point in a way that leaves little room for interpretation. The purpose was not companionship. It was not reflection. It was not the expression of some divine creative impulse. Humanity, according to the oldest account of its own origin, was a labor solution. The creation ritual, described in the Atrahasis epic, involves two primary materials, clay and divine blood. Clay alone was insufficient. The Sumerian and Akkadian traditions both understood clay as the material of the earth, workable, abundant, but inert. Something more was required to animate what would be formed from it. What the texts prescribe is the blood of a god. The assembly identified a candidate, a deity named Ilu, described in the tablets as one who had personality, who possessed the animating quality the new being would need to function. Chronologies of the text indicate this figure was among the Igigi, though the specific circumstances of his selection vary across different tablet versions. What the accounts agree on is the act itself. The god was sacrificed, his blood collected, and Enki, together with the birth goddess Nintu, also called Mami in some versions, mixed that blood with clay. From that mixture, humanity was formed. The language the tablets use to describe what was created is precise in its hierarchy. Humans are not described as younger gods or lesser reflections of divine beings or children of the assembly. They are described as bearers of the yoke, a term drawn directly from agricultural labor. The wooden frame placed across the neck of an ox to keep it moving in the direction required. The Atrahasis epic contains a line that Assyriologists have translated in various forms across different editions, but whose core meaning remains consistent. Let man bear the load of the gods. This was the decree, not a hope, not a blessing, a functional specification. Nintu shaped 14 figures from the mixture, 7 male, 7 female, and the assembly breathed into them what the texts call the Itemmu, the animating spirit. They moved. They were capable of labor. They were capable of understanding, instruction. They were not capable, by design, of the divine deliberation that had allowed the Igigi to recognize their situation and organize against it. The controlled nature of the creation extended to reproduction as well. The earliest versions of the humans described in these texts were not designed to multiply without limit. The assembly established specific mechanisms, a priestess class that would not bear children, infant mortality, and other constraints the tablets enumerate with the careful attention of administrators designing a managed population. This was not incidental. It was intentional. A labor force that grew without bound was a labor force that would eventually become unmanageable. Every parameter of human existence in this telling was set by the assembly for the assembly's purposes. The Igigi, for their part, were released from their duties. The canals would be maintained. The fields would be worked. The temples would receive their offerings. The physical infrastructure of the divine order would continue to function, now staffed by beings who had been created specifically to staff it. From the assembly's perspective, the crisis was resolved. The system had been redesigned rather than dismantled, and the redesign was elegant. The problem of divine labor had been solved by replacing divine laborers with something that would not rebel, because it had not been given the capacity to understand that rebellion was an option. For a time, it held. Cities grew where the new laborers worked. Temples rose, canals ran clear. Offerings accumulated at the feet of the gods who had decreed all of this into existence. At first, it worked exactly as intended. But something unexpected began to happen. The earliest human settlements described in the Sumerian texts are not villages. They are already cities. This is one of the details that tends to get lost in broader discussions of ancient Mesopotamia, the speed with which the textual record moves from the creation of humanity to the existence of fully functioning urban centers. The Atrahasis epic does not linger on a gradual developmental arc. It moves quickly from the formation of the first humans to a world in which those humans are already building, already farming, already organized into the kind of complex settlements that require administration, trade, and religious infrastructure. The implication is deliberate. Humans were not designed to develop slowly. They were designed to work, and they were good at it. The agricultural systems that the new laborers maintained were not simple. Mesopotamia's fertility depended on a careful balance between the flooding cycles of the Tigris and Euphrates and the network of irrigation channels that distributed that water across the land. Too little management and the fields dried. Too much flooding and the channels collapsed. The labor required to hold that balance was constant, seasonal, and technically demanding. Records from later Sumerian administrative archives, the kinds of documents that preserve the practical reality behind the theological narrative, describe grain yields, canal maintenance schedules, workforce rotations, and temple offerings calculated to the fraction. The system the Anunnaki had designed required human beings who were not merely strong but organized, who could follow complex instruction across generations, who could pass knowledge forward. And they did, with striking efficiency. Cities expanded. Uruk, already significant in the earliest period of cuneiform writing, grew into what urban archaeologists now recognize as one of the first true metropolises on Earth. A city of tens of thousands, with monumental architecture, a specialized workforce, long-distance trade networks, and a bureaucratic apparatus sophisticated enough to require the invention of writing to manage it. Temples multiplied. Each city developed its own sacred precinct, its own ritual calendar, its own priestly class dedicated to the maintenance of divine favor. The offerings that had been the whole point of the exercise, the reason the assembly had needed a labor force in the first place, arrived in quantities that dwarfed what the Igigi had ever produced. Humanity was not merely fulfilling its design, it was exceeding it. Agriculture spread beyond the river valleys. Settlements appeared at the margins of the fertile regions, then beyond them. The organizational capacity that had been built into human beings to manage irrigation and temple logistics proved in practice to be transferable to almost any challenge the environment presented. The system was performing beyond its original specifications. And then the numbers began to compound. The reproductive constraints the assembly had built into the original creation, the managed population controls described in the Atrahasis epic, were holding less reliably than designed. Humans were surviving in greater numbers than the early mortality rates had been calibrated to produce. Settlements that had housed hundreds were housing thousands. The thousands were becoming tens of thousands. The Atrahasis epic records what happened next in a detail that is, on its surface, almost mundane, and yet carries the entire weight of what is coming. The noise increased. This is the word the tablets use, consistently and deliberately: noise. Rigmu in Akkadian, a term that encompasses din, clamor, the general tumult of a large population going about its existence. The texts describe it as disturbing the gods, and specifically as disturbing Enlil, whose domain gave him an acute sensitivity to what moved through the air of the world. Modern readers sometimes treat this as metaphor. The tablets do not present it that way. They present it as a specific, measurable problem. The human population had grown to the point where its collective existence was disrupting the divine order in ways the assembly had not anticipated and had not designed against. This is where the first fracture appears in the relationship between the two gods who would define everything that followed. Enlil looked at the situation and saw a system exceeding its tolerances. The administrative logic that governed his thinking was the same logic that had decreed human creation in the first place, and that same logic now indicated that the output of that creation had become a liability. Something needed to be reduced, controlled, brought back within manageable parameters. Enki looked at the same situation and saw something he had made. The blood of a god ran in human veins. He had been present at the mixing, had shaped the specifications of the new being alongside Nintu. Whatever humanity had become, it had become it through a process he had designed. The two positions were not immediately irreconcilable, but they were pointed in opposite directions. And Enlil, who held the Tablet of Destinies and had never been accused of patience, was already moving toward a decision. To the gods, humanity had become a problem. Enlil did not move immediately to destruction. That detail matters. The Atrahasis epic is sometimes read as a story about divine cruelty, gods who created humanity and then tried to erase it. But the sequence the tablets actually describe is more deliberate than that, and in some ways more unsettling. What the text records is a series of calibrated interventions, measured responses, attempts to reduce human population to manageable levels without dismantling the labor system the assembly had spent considerable effort constructing. Enlil, whatever his frustrations, was still an administrator. He did not reach for annihilation first. He reached for plague. The Atrahasis epic describes the first intervention in terms that are clinical in their precision. Enlil put the proposal to the assembly, and the assembly agreed. The god Namtar, a deity associated with fate and with the mechanisms of death, was instructed to release disease upon the human population. Not universally. Targeted. Enough to reduce the numbers, quiet the noise, restore the balance the assembly felt had been disrupted. The plague spread through the human settlements. The tablets describe what followed in images drawn from the observable world. People unable to rise from their beds, communities losing the capacity to function, the ordinary rhythms of labor and offering interrupted by the scale of the dying. For a time, it appeared to be working. Then Enki intervened. The method he used is one of the more striking details in the Atrahasis epic, because it is indirect. Bound by the assembly's collective decision, Enki could not simply countermand the decree. What he did instead was speak to a man, in some tablet versions identified as Atrahasis himself, described as exceptionally wise and attentive to divine communication, and instruct him in how to appeal to Namtar directly, how to organize offerings specifically directed at the deity of plague, how to concentrate worship in a way that would, in effect, flatter Namtar into withdrawing his hand. It worked. The plague receded. The human population stabilized, and then, given time, resumed its growth. Enlil noticed. The assembly reconvened. The second intervention was famine, where plague had moved through the population invisibly. Famine operated through the land itself. The assembly instructed that rain be withheld, that the agricultural systems humanity depended on be starved of the water that fed them. Crops failed. The grain stores that Sumerian cities maintained against seasonal shortfall began to empty. The tablets describe the progression with the same methodical attention they bring to the plague sequence. First shortage, then scarcity, then the specific texture of a civilization beginning to come apart at its food supply. Once again, Enki intervened. Once again, the method was oblique. Instructions passed through Atrahasis about which deities to address, how to redirect offerings, how to open channels of divine appeal that would bring relief without requiring Enki to openly defy the assembly's decree. The rains returned. The harvests recovered. The human population, reduced but not broken, rebuilt. The assembly reconvened again. The third intervention was drought, a withdrawal not merely of rain, but of the generative capacity of the earth itself. Fish disappeared from the rivers. The vegetation at the margins of the settled land withered. The Atrahasis epic describes a human population in genuine extremity at this stage, not simply hungry, but facing the kind of systemic collapse that could, if sustained, accomplish what plague and famine had failed to do. And for the third time, Enki found a path through the boundary of the oath he had sworn to the assembly. For the third time, the disaster was turned aside through means that technically did not violate the letter of the collective decree. For the third time, it failed. What shifted after the third failure was the character of the assembly's deliberation. The Atrahasis epic marks a change in register at this point that Assyriologists have noted across multiple translations. The discussions following the first two disasters have a quality of problem-solving to them. The assembly trying different instruments, adjusting its approach, operating within the assumption that the right calibration would eventually produce the desired result. After the third failure, that quality is gone. What replaces it is something closer to the recognition that the calibration problem cannot be solved, not because the instruments are wrong, but because someone inside the assembly keeps adjusting the outcome. Enlil knew. He could not prove the mechanism of Enki's interventions, bound as they were and technically compliant in direction, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every measure the assembly decreed was being neutralized. The division between the two gods that had opened in Chapter 5 was now a fracture running through the center of the assembly itself. The gods who had decreed human creation were no longer in agreement about whether humanity should continue, and Enlil had run out of patience for half measures. So they made a final decision, one that would leave nothing behind. The assembly did not deliberate long. The Atrahasis epic records the final decision with a brevity that is itself significant. There is no extended theological debate in the tablets, no prolonged weighing of alternatives. The three interventions had failed. The division within the assembly had hardened into something that could not be managed through further discussion. And Enlil, who held the authority to bring the matter to its conclusion, put the proposal forward. A flood. Total, absolute. Not a reduction of human population, but an erasure of it. The assembly agreed, and this time the agreement came with an oath. Every god present swore not to warn humanity of what was coming. The oath was specific in its architecture. It did not merely prohibit direct warning. It bound each member of the assembly to silence through the mechanism that governed divine commitment. To break it openly was to fracture the institutional order the assembly itself rested on. Enlil had learned from the previous failures. He had closed the space Enki had been using, or so he believed. Enki did not break the oath. What he did instead has been described by scholars as one of the most ingenious acts of technical compliance in ancient literature. Bound by his sworn word not to warn any human being, Enki went to the wall of a reed house, the dwelling of Atrahasis, and spoke to the wall. The tablets record his words as addressed to the structure itself, to the reeds, to the clay and the woven grass, not to the man sleeping inside. Wall, listen to me. Reed house, pay attention to my words. What followed were instructions, precise, complete, actionable instructions for building a vessel, its dimensions, its materials, the pitch that would seal it against water, the manner of its construction, the number of decks, the provisions required, the living creatures to be brought aboard. Atrahasis, lying inside that reed house, heard every word. The oath was technically unbroken. The man was saved. Construction began immediately. The Atrahasis epic describes the work with the same practical specificity it brings to everything else: the cutting of reeds, the laying of beams, the application of bitumen across every surface. Neighbors came to help, the tablets note, without understanding fully what they were building or why. Atrahasis deflected their questions with a story about needing to leave, about a journey required by his god. The vessel that emerged from those instructions was not a boat in any conventional sense. It was a sealed structure, more box than ship, designed not to navigate, but to survive, to float passively above whatever came. When it was finished, Atrahasis loaded it. Animals, provisions, his family. The tablets list these in the compressed shorthand of a document, recording an inventory rather than narrating a scene, which gives the passage an odd flatness that somehow increases rather than diminishes its weight. Then the rains began. The Atrahasis epic describes the flood in language that abandons the administrative register entirely. Storm gods, who had been assigned to execute the decree, are described as weeping at what they were doing. Anunnaki deities held their torches aloft at the edges of the world, while the waters rose. The tablets suggest these were gods who had voted for the destruction, and were now witnessing it from a distance, with something the text does not quite name but renders clearly enough: horror at the scale of what consensus had produced. The waters came from above and below simultaneously. The texts describe rain driving down, while the underground waters the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth surged upward. The cities that had taken centuries to build went under. The temples, the physical reason humanity had been created in the first place, collapsed into the water. The canals that the Igigi had once dug, and that human laborers had maintained for generations, disappeared beneath a surface that stretched to every horizon without interruption. Everything the assembly's labor system had produced was gone. Inside the sealed vessel, Atrahasis waited. The Atrahasis epic does not dwell on what that waiting felt like. It is not that kind of text. What it records instead is duration, the storm continuing, the waters holding, the world outside the sealed hull remaining a single, undifferentiated expanse of destruction. Somewhere above that expanse, the gods who had decreed the flood were discovering something the assembly had not adequately considered before casting its vote. Without humans, there were no offerings. Without offerings, the gods were hungry. The tablets describe the Anunnaki gathering above the floodwaters like flies above a sacrifice, a simile the epic deploys without apparent irony, desperate for the smell of burning offerings that no longer rose from a drowned world. The flood had solved the problem Enlil brought to the assembly. It had also destroyed the only thing that made the assembly's existence sustainable. When the waters receded, the world was silent. The silence did not last. Atrahasis opened a window in the sealed vessel and released a bird, then another, then a third. The tablets record this sequence with the same careful attention to procedure that marks the rest of the epic. A man following instructions in reverse, testing the world outside by the behavior of creatures better equipped than he was to read it. The third bird did not return. The waters had receded, enough for land to exist somewhere beyond the hull. When Atrahasis stepped out onto solid ground, the first thing he did was build an altar and make offerings. The smell of burning sacrifice rose into a sky that had seen nothing like it since before the flood began. The Atrahasis epic describes what happened next with an image that has troubled commentators for generations, partly because of what it reveals about the relationship between the gods and the system they had just destroyed. The Anunnaki gathered toward the smell like flies. The simile is the text's own. It is not a later editorial insertion or a translator's embellishment. It appears in the cuneiform directly, and its implications are impossible to soften. The gods who had voted for the annihilation of humanity, who had sworn oaths to ensure no warning reached the surface of the earth, who had watched from above while everything their labor system had built went under. These same gods descended toward the first offering made by the one man who had survived, drawn by hunger they had not felt since before humans existed, and could not satisfy now that humans were nearly gone. The flood had revealed a dependency the assembly had never formally acknowledged. The gods needed humanity at least as much as humanity needed the gods. Enlil arrived last, and when he saw Atrahasis standing beside his altar, alive, intact, the product of exactly the kind of divine interference he had spent 3 failed interventions trying to prevent. The tablets record his fury in terms that are, by this point in the narrative, familiar. He demanded to know who had warned the man, who had broken the oath. The answer, when it came, was Enki. And Enki's defense of his actions is one of the more remarkable passages in the entire epic. He did not apologize. He did not claim the oath had been technically preserved through his method of speaking to a wall rather than directly to a man, though that argument was available to him. Instead, he turned the accusation back on the assembly. The flood, he argued, had been disproportionate. The punishment had not matched the problem, and the result, a drowned world producing no offerings, sustaining no temples, maintaining no canals, demonstrated that the assembly had voted for its own deprivation without fully calculating the cost. The argument was unanswerable. The evidence was floating on the surface of a receding flood. What followed was a negotiation rather than a reckoning. The assembly could not punish Enki without undermining the logic he had just demonstrated. It could not undo the flood. It could not restore the population that had been lost. What it could do was design a new arrangement, one that addressed the original problem Enlil had brought to the table without repeating the catastrophic miscalculation of the solution. The new system the Atrahasis epic describes is more carefully engineered than the first. Population would be managed through mechanisms built into the human condition itself. Rather than through external disasters, the assembly would have to repeatedly authorize and execute. Mortality was formalized, not as a punishment, the texts are careful to note, but as a structural feature. Human beings would not live indefinitely. Their numbers would be naturally constrained by the brevity of individual lives, rather than by plague or famine deployed from above. Additional constraints were introduced. Certain categories of women would not bear children. Infant mortality would remain a feature of the human experience. The population would grow, but within limits that the assembly judged sustainable. Limits that would not require another intervention on the scale of what had just been attempted, and had nearly destroyed everything. The political architecture changed as well, and this shift carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the flood. Direct divine rule, the model in which the Anunnaki governed humanity's fate through immediate and visible intervention, was quietly retired. In its place, the texts describe a new intermediary layer, human kings appointed through divine mandate, who would govern on behalf of the gods rather than under their direct supervision. The Sumerian king list, which opens with kingship descending from heaven, resumes after the flood with a new sequence of rulers. Shorter reigns now, measured in decades rather than the cosmic thousands of years that preceded the deluge. Human time, not divine time. Mortal administrators managing a world the gods would oversee from an increasing distance. Divine authority did not disappear. It became structural rather than personal, embedded in the institution of kingship, in the ritual calendars, in the temple systems that human laborers continued to maintain, but no longer expressed through direct assembly intervention in daily human affairs. The Anunnaki had changed, but they had not disappeared. The world that emerged from the flood was not the world that had preceded it. Not theologically, not politically, not in the way the Anunnaki appeared in the texts that followed. The shift was gradual enough that no single document marks the transition. But, across the centuries of Mesopotamian literary production that came after the Atrahasis epic, a pattern becomes visible. The Anunnaki, who had convened in the Shekinah to assign fates, who had debated the Igigi rebellion, who had voted on plague and famine and flood, those figures do not vanish, but they recede, and what moves into the foreground in their place is something different. Not a council of active administrators, but a framework. a set of principles made divine, a structure of authority that no longer required the gods to be present in order to function. This is what transformation looks like in ancient theology. Not replacement, abstraction. The Epic of Gilgamesh, assembled in its most complete form during the Old Babylonian period, but drawing on Sumerian compositions considerably older, marks one of the clearest points of transition in how the Anunnaki are rendered. Gilgamesh is a king, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, ruler of Uruk, possessor of a strength and restlessness that the opening tablets describe as both magnificent and destructive. His story is not primarily about the Anunnaki as a governing council. It is about mortality, about what it means to be partly divine in a world that will not grant full divinity, about the search for something the assembly, in its post-flood restructuring, had deliberately withheld from human beings. When the Anunnaki appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they appear in a context that would have been unrecognizable to the figures deliberating in the Shekinah. They are judges of the underworld, seated in the realm of the dead, presiding over the fate of souls after life, rather than the fate of civilizations during it. The administrative function remains: judgment, decree, the assignment of outcomes, but it has been relocated, moved from the living world into the realm beneath it. The Anunnaki had not lost their authority. They had been repositioned to exercise it somewhere human beings could not directly observe or petition or be affected by until their lives were already over. The rise of Marduk represents the final major transformation in how Mesopotamian theology organized its divine hierarchy. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, composed during the period of Babylon's political ascendancy, and likely reaching its canonical form sometime in the 2nd millennium BC, retells the story of cosmic order from a different starting point. Here, the primary narrative is not the creation of humanity or the management of a labor crisis. It is a battle. Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, defeating the primordial chaos embodied in Tiamat, and from that victory constructing the ordered world. What the Enuma Elish does to the Anunnaki is subtle but significant. They remain present. They appear as the gods who grant Marduk his authority before the battle, who acclaim his victory afterward, who are assigned their stations, 50 of them, by the victorious god once the new order is established. But they are no longer the governing council. They are the audience, the validators, the institutional framework within which a new supreme authority legitimizes itself. Marduk does not replace the Anunnaki. He absorbs their collective mandate into a single figure, and in doing so, transforms a council into a court. The political logic behind this theological shift was not obscure to anyone living in Babylon during the period of the epic's composition. A city-state asserting regional dominance needed its patron deity to possess cosmic authority. The Anunnaki, as a collective, could confer that authority. And once conferred, their role in the ongoing narrative diminished in proportion to the elevation of the figure they had endorsed. What remained, across all of these transformations, was the structure. The Anunnaki began as an explanation for how the world was governed, why floods came, why kings held power, why labor was the condition of human existence, why mortality was built into the human frame, rather than being a punishment applied from outside. Every major question a Mesopotamian city dweller might ask about the terms of their existence had an answer somewhere in the Anunnaki tradition. The answers changed across centuries and city-states and political realignments. But the questions they addressed remained constant. Power comes from somewhere above the individual. Authority must be legitimized by something larger than the person who holds it. Labor is the price of existence within an ordered system. And the ordered system, however it is managed, whoever sits at its apex, is preferable to the chaos that preceded it. These were not merely theological propositions. They were the operating assumptions of every political system Mesopotamia produced, from the earliest city-states of Eridu and Uruk through the empires of Akkad, Ur, Babylon, and Assyria. The Anunnaki encoded those assumptions in narrative form and pressed them into clay, where they survived long after the cities that produced them had returned to dust. They were not just gods of the sky. They were the architects of how ancient humans understood power itself.